Aurelia, thank you so much for being here and congratulations on being named a Bloomberg Catalyst.
Thank you, Alex. Lovely to meet you. Thanks for having me.
So, why don't we start by having you talk a little bit about your work? What is Gavi? What is the COVAX facility? And what role is it playing in helping bring the world out of this pandemic?
So, if you think about the very beginning of the pandemic, it was clear that we didn't just need vaccines, we needed vaccinations, and we needed billions of them. And that meant that we had to find a way not to repeat what had happened in the last pandemic, where you had a small number of countries that basically bought up the entire global supply of what was then the swine flu vaccines and left essentially none for the rest of the world. And so that was really what COVAX was created for. It was created to solve this problem. And we created a partnership with Gavi, my organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF. And we built this coalition of partners to support 193 economies, which together represent about 90% of the global population, really to ensure that people in all countries would have fair and equitable access to vaccines. And so this is really what COVAX is trying to do, and particularly for the most vulnerable, thinking about how they can be protected so that the billions of people who don't have the ability to pay for COVID-19 vaccines can have access to them. So particularly, we created what's called an advanced market commitment, an AMC. And so for the poorest countries, the 92 poorest countries, they can have access to vaccines with the help of donor funding.
So, you talked about lessons from previous pandemics, but what do you think are the two or three biggest lessons from this pandemic? And, why wasn't the world more prepared going into this pandemic?
I think the first lesson is really around how we can think about making sure that we have pandemic preparedness sort of more widely. Maybe I think the second lesson would be around the fact that timing is everything during a pandemic. So it's not just about having the vaccines, it's about getting the vaccines on time. And we really are in a race against time, particularly when you think about the fact that we are very lucky to have safe and effective vaccines, but we have variants emerging. And so if we're not protecting enough people quickly enough, we get into potentially a cycle where the pandemic drags on. And then maybe lastly, I would say the third big lesson is around what we've learned about fostering global collaboration in a really unprecedented crisis. The pandemic has shown that even though the world was not prepared, we had a lot of the pieces in place in order to respond quickly, amazing scientific collaboration, being able to take vaccines through to development very, very quickly. But being able to have a global infrastructure so that we can have the manufacturing capacity in place, that we can have, thanks to COVAX, a way to remove the financial barriers to accessing vaccines. All of those items really needed to come into place and build on the strength of the existing organizations to make it come together.
So, when I think about how historians are likely to write this chapter of history, I think two big stories, that stand out for me at least. One, of course, is the remarkable pace of innovation that you just referenced. The fact that so rapidly, using novel technology, vaccines were created in record time. But the second is really the remarkably unequal access to that innovation. So the question is, looking forward, when you think about future pandemic preparedness, but even more broadly, how do we continue to foster and encourage that kind of innovation in biomedical science and science broadly speaking, but also make sure that we have much more equal access around the world to innovations coming in health?
I think with around 300,000 new cases a day, this pandemic is far from over, and we still have a huge disparity in access to COVID-19 vaccines, particularly in the lower income economies, and still a fair way to go. So I think the fact that we have vaccines available is indeed a testament, I think, to the level of innovation, particularly with the novel technologies like the mRNA vaccines. But I think also innovation comes in terms of how we think about the multilateral response. And perhaps the other aspect in terms of innovation is how we make them available at scale. And I think this is where here aspects like technology transfer come into play, where one way is around increasing the manufacturer capacity of existing manufacturers. The other way is to try to have more manufacturers be able to produce and I think have more resilience with a wider geographic base. So as we think about the different aspects, making sure that we can think around the distribution of innovation, and here particularly in the context of manufacturing and geographic diversity is important as well.
Yeah, so following up on that, when you look at the sum total of all of the resources that COVAX and the ACT Accelerator asked for, it was pretty modest, right? I mean, it pales in comparison to the size of domestic economic and other stimulus that a lot of the wealthier countries in the world directed at this pandemic. How do you address that imbalance? Why weren't more resources spent? And would you consider this either a failure of multilateralism or a partial success that gives us lessons for how to do this better going forward?
I think many simply underestimated, I think, the impact this pandemic could have, not just on people's lives and on livelihoods, but as we've all seen it, on our way of lives, on business, commerce, and trade. And so I think that that's something to bear in mind. And I think as governments were looking to their response, I think it was quite a natural reaction for leaders and governments to protect their citizens first. And in fact, it is their duty to do so. But I think the world is also waking up to the fact that with an infectious disease, protecting your people means you have to think globally. And I think we're starting to see that play out. We've had unprecedented financial support for our COVAX AMC by donors. As we reflect forward, I think it's about thinking how we can build on this realization and this wake-up call. We've seen G7 leaders come forward with a commitment to share more than 800 million additional doses. And so I think the donated doses, I think, will be an important part of it. But really, for us, the reflection is around making sure that COVAX fosters a new way of global collaboration and builds on these lessons so that we can have a more systematic multilateral approach.
So one phrase that I always hear when I listen to policymakers around the world talk is this idea of a return to normal. That's the goal, right? Getting back to normal. But in the area of global public health and the work you do, what should we not return to? In other words, what changes brought about by this pandemic do you think should be permanent when we think about medicine and health and public health around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I think from my side, I think it's still far from clear what the new normal is going to be. I mean, I think there's a chance that we will end up in a situation where COVID-19 becomes endemic. If that happens, then we may need regular COVID-19 vaccines, a little bit like we do for flus. So whatever post-COVID landscape looks like, I think we need to think about the preparing for the next pandemic, which, as I mentioned before, I think is pretty much a certainty. It's a matter of, when it will happen, not if. And so I think if we want to avoid repeating another global crisis on the scale that we've just lived, we really need to think about this question on how do we get vaccines to all the corners in the world very, very quickly. And we learn from some of the mistakes around, export bans and vaccine hoarding.
So we've talked a lot about what didn't happen, but with the goal of ending on a hopeful note here, what good news do you see coming out of the pandemic, particularly for developing countries? Do you see, this as a catalyst for spurring more innovation around the world, changing how we think about public health?
My hope is that by having shone a light on the people in lower income economies, this really terrible crisis that we are all living through will help the world to start to recognize the fact that we just live in a very, very interconnected world. And it's very important for everyone to have equitable access to health services. And of course, it's not just because everyone has a right to a healthy future, which they do, but also what this pandemic has shown is that infectious diseases put everyone in the same boat. And so I guess my hope is that if this can lead to a positive shift in attitude and in support from governments, from the private sector, from the public, in terms of what ongoing global health problems the world face today, particularly poorer countries, I think that would be helpful.